This video is brought to you by HalloCasa. Our tool transforms independent local real estate agents to global real estate agents. Create your own profile for free and get contacted by international investors. Sign up with the link in the description.
Hello and welcome everyone to our 224th session of HalloCasa. My name is Michael and today I'm talking to Kosmas Theodorides from Athens, Greece. Kosmas is President of the Confederation of European Real Estate Associations, CERA, and Vice President of CEPI, and a leading voice in EU housing policy. Kosmas recently spoke before the European Parliament Special Committee on the Housing Crisis about vacant homes and repurposing. Today we're going to dig into affordable housing, macro drivers like inflation and monetary policies, practical EU measures, and what this all means for current and next generations. Kosmas, thank you so much for being on the show for the second time. I really enjoyed our first conversation. Let's dive directly into actually this current real estate market in Athens, particularly where you're based at the moment. What's the situation like?
So thank you for having me back, Michael. The situation in Athens is a little bit cooling down. We have left the double-digit increases per year. So last semester that we have on record, it was about 7.5% increase. So the market is doing well. And money-wise, the transactions are quite stable. And the main problem we're facing, not unlike most cities in the Western world, is that inventory is very low. We don't have many properties on the market.
We are talking once in a while via LinkedIn, and we are talking about the real root causes of affordable housing. And I really like your ideas and also your opinion there. And you spoke before the European Parliament Special Council recently. What was that about and what was your message there?
I think we are in front of a multifaceted problem, if we can call it a problem, a multifaceted reality. So the first bit of reality is that we have a lot of housing units, but they are on the periphery of the countries. And the big cities, we don't have many housing units. And that's where the problem is, because people are leaving the countryside and they are concentrating in the big cities in a process that we call astephilia, which means the inordinate love for big cities. Because big cities is where jobs are and where the economic activity is and where all the perks of modern life, essentially, as we imagine it, are concentrated. So this is a big problem because more people are coming, especially young people are coming into the big cities, and the big cities do not have enough housing units to accommodate them. So that's the one thing. And the other thing, of course, another major contributing factor, because there are many things that are at play here, is that we have so much money printed. It's remarkable. If you go back to 2008, which was the big financial crisis, and then you go on to the corona epidemic, you will see that circulating printed currency has gone up, has skyrocketed. And sooner or later, printed money in general finds its way to real estate. This is an old saying, but it's very true. Sooner or later, all wealth comes from the land and goes back to the land. And you can read that in any philosophical or economic or social context you like. But this is the reality. Sooner or later, money that floats around is going to go to real estate. And you know something, Michael, it's like I have actually, I talked about that in the European Parliament as well. And I am saying this in many of my articles and my interviews. When I first came back to Athens from London, England, I bought a flat. And I bought flat for 50,000 euros. It was a 50 square meter. It is a 50 square meter flat. And I bought it for 50,000 euros. And during the crisis, it went down in price. So if I had to sell it, I would sell it for 25, perhaps 30,000 euros. But I kept it. I held on to it. So after a couple of years ago, somebody asked it for a golden visa. And I was going to sell it for 150,000, which you may say is, wow, it's amazing. It's like you made 3 times your money. But the reality of the matter is that when I bought it, 50,000 euros in 2005, the golden sovereign, the golden pound, was valued at 96 euros. The other day, it was over 800 euros. So I actually paid something like 500 golden sovereigns, a little bit more, for that flat. And now it's not even worth 200 golden sovereigns. So you have to keep these things in mind, right? When people ask me, why do prices go up? I asked them, in what currency? In euros and in dollars, of course they go up. But in gold and coins, they go down.
You are mentioning something which is hardly discussed oftentimes. It's the money printing, especially from 2008 onwards. And I feel many people are having the discussion around this topic and focused on symptoms, more construction, better infrastructure, social housing. But I must say I totally agree with you. And especially during COVID, I think apart from the COVID rates during COVID, which we heard in the press, was the M2 supply of money and basically a crazy sharp increase of money printing. And most of the people were clapping and were saying, that's beautiful, more money for us. And now we are seeing the repercussions. And as you say, we see it. And many people there were saying, what will happen is high asset classes and then goes down to salad and potatoes after some years. And everyone is always right now talking about the high prices of football stars and stuff. It's just another signal of what is happening. First question, why do you understand and why do you think that is? What is the economic driver that first and foremost it goes into those high assets, those highly priced assets?
I think we have to realize that the economy has changed in the past few decades. And I first came across that reading a piece by Thomas Piketty. And I think he's right. You have the assets and you have labor, right? So we used to, in the 60s and the 50s, after the after-war period, labor was highly priced. So with your own salary, you could buy a house, you could do holidays in Greece if you were in Germany and so on and so forth. But that slowly changed. And actually in the past few years, I think it's changing very rapidly. So what's going on now is that assets appreciate at a higher rate than labor does, so than salaries, right? So assets grow, for example, in Athens, assets grow at something like 10% and salaries grow at 3 or 4%. That means that if the only thing you have to sell is your labor, the only thing you have to live off is your salary, sooner or later you will hit a wall. And what happened was, we mentioned the massive printing exercises, but we have to remember that also wars, they need funding. And when you have an active war, like we have here in our backyard in Ukraine, this needs a lot of money. And a lot of money is printed and goes there. And these imbalances, sooner or later, they're going to filter into politics. And you can see that. I was reading the other day that in Germany, Chancellor Merz said that we are living above our standards. Yes, if you're spending money, it's like you have only so much money circulating with so much wealth. If you decide that you need to spend more money on defense, and I'm not making a criticism of that, I think that perhaps this is a good idea, but if you have to spend more money on defense, of course you have to cut from the other bits that you're spending money on, and the social policy, unfortunately, is the prime target at the moment throughout the West.
Money flows to the rich, and the rich are getting richer by the concentration of the money into those asset classes, especially the money influx into higher generation or assets which have a higher generation of return. Basically, it's very interesting maybe to buy in the center of Athens than in a rural area. So more and more investors are going there.
This actually, I think this is correct. It's also, from my experience, also wealthy people behave very differently from people who live from paycheck to paycheck. So when a rich person, a business person, or an investor or what have you, because you have so many categories nowadays, when they make more money, there was more money during the COVID era, so more money went to everybody. And I think that was actually correct, because otherwise the economy would collapse. But for everyday people, what we did with most of the money that we got is like we spend it on everyday expenses. But rich people, the money they got, and it was probably more money than because of the way the economy works, right? They tend to invest them. They tend to invest the money. When you invest it, money tends to accumulate towards one direction. Of course, when you spend it, that's it. It's gone, right? So I think this plays a role. This has created an asymmetry that, makes, let's say, the wealthier percentiles of most Western societies, wealthier even. And I think this is not something that is happening nowadays. This has been throughout history. If you check history, when you don't have equalizing initiative, increased taxation and what have you have concentration of wealth in very few hands. This is normal. It's like how the game of money is played. And you know something, Michael, I've been thinking about it because we had this conversation as well on LinkedIn. What can you do to address it in a globalized world? Because it's like if you decide, like in France, for example, in France, they have this conversation that they're going to tax only the super rich. And what do the super rich do? They just move to Italy because the taxes are lower. Or they even move to Greece. Like one of the reasons that our real estate market is doing so is like we have a lot of expats that used to live in London and now they're moving to Greece because we give them tax incentives. It's very difficult. If you don't have a globalized approach, then people will just take the money and move away.
Let's unpick a couple of things you just mentioned. Yes, the money supply and the printing was benefiting in a way like the individual, but there were many laws and regulations which were basically benefiting the big corporations because they had better lawyers, because we were only allowed to to order food via Uber Eats, so the money goes there. And so we had a lot of incentives which were implicitly or even passively exactly helping the rich to get richer, while the moms and pop shops, they were out of business. They had no lobby, they had no measurement to survive. Now moving forward, do you think that apart from a global approach, are there other elements which can even change the situation?
Let me tell you what I think the most straightforward, because sometimes you need to, if you remember Ben Bernanke, we had the term at the time, helicopter money. So sometimes you need to throw helicopter money to your society, otherwise your economy will collapse. And don't get me wrong, I don't have an ideological stance against the rich people. Most of my clients are actually quite rich people. But what I'm more worried about is like the squeeze of the middle classes. So as you said, the little shopkeepers and what have you, which of course is part of the economy cycle, like these small outlets we see here in Athens, they have to close because they're no longer making money. But I think we have to think a bit outside of the box and say, okay, if we are living in an asset economy where assets are taking center stage, what do we really need to do to assist small and medium, like this part of society that is like middle class and lower middle class, or even working class? Although nowadays we don't have many people in that class because we are deindustrialized in most cases. And I think, and this is what I have been proposing to the Greek government. I actually yesterday had a meeting with a counselor of the prime minister, but also at the European level. So essentially what we need to do is we need to remake landlords of the middle class and the lower middle class. Because what happens now is like people, in order to finance their retirement, because sooner or later we will all grow to old age, right? We cannot be productive forever. In order to finance the retirement, they're selling their homes and then they're living like off the savings for a few years, but they're not transmitting these properties. When you're middle class and lower middle class, you're not transmitting it to your children. And this is where the children have a problem. This is where our youth all over Europe and in Greece especially are in dire straits. So what I'm lobbying for is, okay, what we need to do, the main thing that poor people are liking, like when you're young and you don't have a lot of money, you're lacking a deposit. You're not necessarily lacking the willingness of a bank to give you a mortgage, because if you're working, in most cases, in most big cities, it is safer for you to have a mortgage than to pay rent, and it's definitely cheaper in most cases. There are exceptions, but there are few. So my idea is we make a policy of lump sums, and we're saying, okay, Michael, you decide to go into a marriage or into a civil union with somebody else. So at that moment, you can get a loan from the state, 20,000 euros, let's say, which in most cases are enough as a down payment so that you can get your own flat, right? And then when you have your first child, this could be at a low interest rate. And when you have your first child, this becomes with no interest rate. And then when you have a second child, then this is a gift to you, right? So we give it to you on the second or third child. And this comes and ties in with the demographic collapse of the European Union and the West in general. This is a very simple and a very cheap way, it's very inexpensive, to give an incentive to people to create new households and, of course, to create families. And I think I was explaining yesterday, we had some plans, and it's actually not very expensive at all compared to all the other strategies, like all these big bureaucratic strategies to encourage demographic increase, which have failed with very few exceptions.
It is so multifaceted, this entire topic and this entire element, because going back to the abandonment of the gold standard, and I will come back to your point in a second. Do you think that this was one of the main critical factors which happened in history, and that we might need to go back to a certain asset-based standard, maybe even Bitcoin-based, anything which has a simulation of gold, in order to overcome this need and the search for debt and money printing? And me being German, having seen right now what is happening in the German government, it's basically a coup, if I may say so, because the new chancellor, totally broke his promise, I think 2 weeks into the parliament, by issuing a lot of new debt. And that's basically a common pattern, and he gets along with it. He's able to make it happen, and no one really cries out. Do you think a certain, maybe even an economical crash needs to happen, and is also from a macroeconomic perspective actually a normal element in each cycle, that there has to be a crash and a certain purge and a cleansing of all the bad debt? Because I feel, especially since 2007, since 2008, we have inherited and internalized this idea of a crash is bad and may never happen. But then we are starting to have this bailout of all the bad debt, and we are just pulling it and pushing it further and further down the road until we are in a situation like that. And this might, in a dystopian outlook, even lead to the abandonment of the European Union, because it's just not financially viable anymore. What do you think is, and even maybe looking into, I know I'm touching upon a lot of elements here right now, but
yeah, that's
also
a lot of questions, Michael. All of them were very interesting, but it's a lot of questions.
I know. Maybe you are able to give me like your point of view there, because I'm also I'm in my head, in my eyes, looking at Argentina and Milei and his measures there. What is, in all this aspect and all this element, what is your opinion, or what do you think about all this?
Well, let me start from the historical viewpoint, which is something like I have a soft spot about. Definitely, the abandonment of the gold standard has been a watershed for the world economic history. And I don't think there was an alternative. And there wasn't an alternative because the US at the time had spent so much money on the Vietnam Wars. As we discussed earlier, wars are like a major printing money exercise anyway, because you need to finance. And I think this worked very well for the West, worked very well for the American financial system, and us, of course, in Europe, because we are like an extension of all the Western world. And it created havoc for places like Africa, some places in Asia and Latin America. So all these, if you're a bit cynical, you see these exercises as a redistribution of wealth. And let me point out that inflation itself is a redistribution of wealth. One of the things that is a characteristic of inflation is like wealth is going to be redistributed. Now, my difference with the ideologues of the left, who are like saying eat the rich and the rich are bad and the poor are good, my difference is I'm a business person. So when I see that there's going to be a redistribution, I am trying to turn my sails of my little boat and say, okay, the wealth is going that direction. Let's go all to that direction so that we can become more wealthy. So I am a more little shop owner mentality, or a shop or a business mentality, if you like. Now, do we need to go back to gold standard? The gold standard was very problematic very often because there's only so much gold. And from time to time, because rich people tend to accumulate and not spend. So when they were seeing that there was a crisis going on, they were just holding on to money. There was no money on the market, and the market was facing crashes. You know that because you have studied that. It's very common knowledge. So the abandonment of the gold standard was actually very good. Economies are facing fewer recessions than before. And how does that happen? By printing money. So printing money is not necessarily bad. It is a tool, but sometimes it has heavy side effects. It's like taking a drug. You can take a drug and it will cure you, but it can create side effects. And what we're dealing with right now is like the side effects of this type of medicine. So will we need a currency that is like gold-based in the future? I don't know. Anything that has finite, that is finite, it has a certain ceiling, anything will create problems with deflation and with market crashes. It's inevitable. Of course, what we're seeing right now is that, as you said, because the market cannot really correct itself, because every time the market tries to correct itself, more money is printed, so the market in nominal terms goes up. Because this is what's happening right now with the assets. And this is, if I can say this, a friend of mine says, currently we are at a bubble of everything. Everything is a bubble. Every asset is hugely overpriced. And why? Because there's so much printed money around. It makes sense. But then again, if this is going to continue, and we don't know how long it's going to continue for, and let me put an asterisk here to come back to that, if this is going to continue, then this is where we should direct ourselves to. And if you really want your citizens to be wealthy, if you're a politician and you want your voters to be wealthy, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make their access to assets as easy as possible. In a few words, if you want to make young people wealthy or poor people wealthy, what you do is you make it easier for them to buy a home. Because the easier way to distribute helicopter money is actually if everybody has a home and prices of the homes go up. It's the easiest thing. I'm saying to my friends, if you have a flat that is worth 100,000 euros, right? It was 5 years ago, it was worth 100,000 euros. We had increases of about 10% for 4 or 5 years. And so that flat actually puts on the side about 10,000 euros of value each year. And it's nearly impossible for the average Greek family to make that savings per year. So you have to adjust with the type of society and the type of economy that you're living in. But let me tell you, because you touched upon this, and this is a topic that I'm very interested in, the economic cycles. I first came across this name of Kondratiev's cycles when I was much younger, and I always keep him on mind because there are cycles. So like there will be good years and bad years. You read it in the Bible. So in the Bible, you have the 7 good years and the 7 lean years. So that's a typical 7-year cycle, which is in agricultural societies, it's quite common. But in real estate, as it turns out, we have 18-year cycles. So like in the States, in America, where you have the best archives, the cycles that they used to have before this printed money exercise, there was 18 years. Now it's a little bit more like 9 years. And we don't really know because every time an asset class faces a significant drop, central banks jump in and they print more money. Or they create more debt because essentially all money is debt and all debt is money. It's like as long as somebody is there to monetize it.
You just mentioned one keyword, families. And in the news, there was recently quite a headline regarding schools being closed in Greece because there's just not enough children. Obviously, that's another symptom and another result of insecurity of parents not feeling safe enough in order to give birth to children, create a family. Do you think it can be reversed? Do you think, you mentioned before, and I want to come back to that, to your idea of giving land and giving assets to families and inherit it. Apart from that, do you have any other ideas, and what's your outlook there?
This is a very interesting question. It's one of my more sentimental topics because I first started talking about the demographic problems as soon as I came back to Greece, because I could see back then, like the middle of the decade after 2000, that the situation was not going very well. And what happens now is after 20 years of crisis, essentially, because we have let's say 15 years after the first signs of the big crisis, you have a huge economic squeeze. And of course, households do not have much money and so on and so forth. So young people don't want to create families. And this is not particular in Greece. It's all over the Western world. In big cities, people are they face a dilemma. Should I live my life as best as I can, or should I embark into creating a family that is definitely going to squeeze me out of financial resources? And more people opt out for living on their own or living with a partner without children, because children are a financial burden in modern societies. And unless we alleviate this burden, unless we make it easier for families to carry it, we have a problem. Because demographically, it's like the whole of the West is collapsing. And Greece, of course, Greece is not one unified thing. Of course, we are a country, but if you go to the rich islands like Santorini or Mykonos or Crete, you will see that demographically they're doing very well. Why? Because people have money and people want to create families. It's like in our nature. But if you go to the rural areas that are more poor, then you're facing problems. People are migrating to the big cities. They were poor where they came from. They most likely they will stay poor when they come here. And it's a dead-end situation. It's like then you reach 50 and okay, you can no longer have a family. And it feeds in a vicious circle. But we can't break that vicious circle. And this is what I'm advocating to the politicians. But sometimes you need to speak about things for decades before the politicians take notice and they try to do something about it. Having said that, we had recently the first measures towards that direction. I'm really happy about it.
Tell us about those in particular, because we have also, you just mentioned the difficulty of implementing something on the national level. People just leave and the money will flow out and you have a money drain. And I say that because I talk to many people from around the world. And I spoke to a friend recently who is from Portugal saying, it's for me, tax-wise, doesn't make any sense to buy a second home, because I would pay 50% on the proceeds or on the capital gains of my second home. So he's basically, in his calculation, he's basically deciding to sell the first one and go for another one, which has an asset price, a higher asset price in itself, so that he doesn't have to pay the 50% tax burden, which I thought that's actually interesting. It's actually a good approach, because this allows, well, let's say that prevents rich people from buying the entire city of Lisbon and creating their own portfolio, because it's just not tax-wise viable. Do you think there's anything like that and you have the privilege to talk on a European Union-wide level, and it would have a huge impact to create something on a European-wide level, because it is already, we talk about 300 million people or 500 million people. Do you think there's something possible like that?
I am always very careful with taxation, because taxation is like the genie that comes out of the bottle. You release it and you don't know, there will always be side effects down the line. Now, the Iberian Peninsula, both Portugal and Spain, they are tackling their problems with ways that I'm not entirely sure how sustainable they will be in the long run. Because there are all these ideas about, for example, you have red caps, you have capital gains taxes, you have stamp duties that are very high on second homes and what have you. But all this can be easily bypassed if you move into companies. So companies do not, it's like you just, and you know that because in Germany, most homes are owned by companies. And if I had to choose, do I want my landlord to be a company or a private person? I would probably go for a private person with my experience as well. So I think it's part of the reality, but also of the efforts of Europe, that little people can have 2 or 3 homes. If we go to a situation where 50% of our home stock belongs to companies, I've seen how some of these companies are functioning, and I'm not sure we want to go that way. I am not sure. It's because companies, they know how to evade taxes, right? How to avoid taxes, rather, because in a legal way, not in an illegal way. And I think I prefer the small and medium stakeholder model that we currently have in Europe, rather than going into these big multinationals that own very much of the national wealth. And you can see that in the States. In the States, if you calculate how much, what percentage of their homes is directly or indirectly owned by a few major companies, it's actually thought-provoking. Because, and I don't mean it necessarily in a direct way, right? But mortgages go through financial structures, and these financial structures at the top of the feeding chain, they're owned by a handful of companies. Would I like this to happen in the European Union? I don't think so. I would rather we stayed with a small and medium ownership model.
With CEPI and before the European Commission right now, give us and the audience an overview what you're right now at hand discussing, the policies, so that we get an idea of the elements you're pursuing at the moment.
Just launched an idea about the European Home Ownership Day, where we are trying to make a day to encourage especially young people or people who do not have their first home to engage into buying one. And I think this is very critical because it's not just about money, it's about the culture and about the feelings that are associated with a certain move. We definitely need to stop young people being discouraged and thinking that they cannot buy their first property. I think this is very critical. And this is why we're working with the European Parliament and a lot of MEPs to make this European Home Ownership Day come to life. I have to say that since the last time we talked, a lot of things have happened at the European level, and I'm really happy about it. Because as you may remember, when I first became president of the association, I went to Brussels and the people were telling me, this is not an EU competence. Housing has nothing to do with the EU. You're just wasting your time. And I was like, okay, let me try. And now we have a European commissioner, we have the special committee on the housing crisis, and the week before last, Ursula von der Leyen, she had the shortlist, the agenda of the major topics that were going to be discussed for now and for the next budget. And housing was among them. I was like flying, literally, because we went within 3 short years from, don't bother, housing is not an EU competency. And we went into having housing as like the second or third item after things like defense and the sustainable, I can't remember the exact list, but it was there. It was like, I was like so happy about it. And it is something that the European Union has to do, because as a lot of the problems we have right now and a lot of the problems that we can foresee we will have in the next few years come from the implementation of EU regulations. For example, if you need to upgrade the energy consumption level of your flat, but you don't have the money, then of course, if the EU made you do this, they have to give you an incentive and some help to do it. Otherwise, how can you do it, especially in the poorer countries like my own?
It is exactly this dilemma of free market, liberal markets, but then getting the politics involved and only to a certain extent, and saying if you say A, then you also have to say B and C. You cannot just impose certain policies on us and then let it be and say, yeah, but we want to have the markets to rule the prices. And it's exactly basically you pushing them to say, no, wait, you can't just impose those elements which make it unaffordable for us and not viable, because it sounds nice to be green and have everything isolated, but if the normal blue-collar worker can't just afford his house anymore because he's supposed to do the reinvestment, then he has to sell and he's not becoming a house owner anymore. Is that is that like your underlying motivation? Do you actually want that to happen, or what do you actually want to achieve, dear European Parliament?
Absolutely. You got it spot on. And this is why I have been trying very hard and lobbying, if you like, to make sure that our policymakers realize that their decisions, they might be very well intentioned, but in real life, in the real markets, they're going to change everyday life forever. And let me add something else, since you also like history, Michael. I have an interest in Bronze Age. So Bronze Age, something like the second millennium, it was the first time that Greek was written here in Greece. We have this writing system called Linear B. And when this was deciphered and we can now read the tablets, you know what we realized? And this is actually a recent scholarship. We realized that almost 4,000 years ago, what was going on was you had the state, you had the Wanax, which is like the king, right? And the king was controlling everything. The palace was controlling everything. But because he could not really control everything, he had to delegate some of the economic activity to some of his friends, let's say the nobility of the time, and to some merchants. So if you check these archives, which are almost 4,000 years ago, and you can see that you have the state, because the state was the king, basically, right? And the structure around the king. Of course, they wanted to control everything, but they realized even back then that we cannot really do that without the commerce people, the merchants, and we cannot do it without local people that are associated with us and they can control the economy at the local level. And this has been going on ever since that time. And it's like for 4,000 years, more or less, you can see this phenomena unrolling cycles that come and go for 4,000 years or perhaps even more.
Kosmas, I know your time is limited. Thank you so much for the conversation. I really like your approach. I really like your opinion, and I also appreciate your efforts because you are pushing through and you are saying, you're not taking no for an answer that easily. And you say, no, wait,
No. I'm a bit strong-headed sometimes. Yes, Michael, you're right.
Let's see. And you have been so successful already that, as you say, that it's right now on the desk of Ursula von der Leyen and the European Parliament and say, okay, this.
I think, let me just say, I had a small contribution in a phenomenon that is like much bigger than any of us. And the politicians just got wind of it and they realized that they need to do something about it. And I hope they're going to do things towards the right direction because, as we discussed, this is very important. Political decisions, they create an aftermath for years to come.
And those years to come, what is your wish and your, let's say, if you think ahead for the next couple of years, and we have to think in years when it comes to this level, what do you wish for the future to come for the next years regarding affordable housing, which is maybe also attainable and not super utopian?
No, I don't think it's utopian. I think it's very within reach. And I think what I'm working on is like, I am trying to convince for programs that will allow young people and people who do not own homes to be able to get into the property ladder, because this is what is very important, Michael. I can see now, after so many years of crisis here, it is very difficult when you reach your retirement age and you don't have a home, you don't have a property. It is very difficult to live because this is essentially all the social security thing was a kind of like a pyramid, but within a political wrapping. And now that we don't have enough young people coming in, we are not going to see much in pensions. And if we see them, they are not going to have a high purchasing value. So you need to have at least a place where you can live your last days without worrying that you don't have to pay the rent. And we need to act now. And we can do it, and we can do it with very little expense. And we can create, again, a middle class that is home owning and that has any interest in democracy, because this is also very critical.
I really appreciate your honest and clear approach there, because yes, we cannot guarantee anything regarding our pension. And if it's maybe still existing, it's one thing, but how much is it worth? Because the inflationary adjustment cannot keep up with the pace. Unlike a property where you are legally allowed to, if you rent it out, to increase the rent. So you can actually increase it according to the inflation. And then on the other hand, you don't have to be reliant on a landlord who can pick and choose who's the tenant. And if you are
absolutely
70 years old or 80 years old, how difficult is it for you to still get a room or get a place to live? Yeah, and is there anything else you would like to mention to the audience which we haven't touched upon?
I would just, I'm sure, like this is housing has taken center stage in the political agenda, and the housing crisis is all over Europe. So I think we're going to discuss about all these things again and again. But what I really want to say to people is, if you have not invested in assets and you just have your salary, seriously think about going into the asset side of the economy. Because if you buy a flat, it will save you from so much trouble, but it will also create wealth for you. And creating wealth only by your salary is not going to be as easy in the future as it was in the past.
Perfect. Kosmas, thank you so much. And yeah, sending the best regards. How can people reach out to you if they are curious to get in contact with you?
You can always include my email address or my social media accounts, because I'm very active on both fronts.
Perfect. Yes, you are amazing. I will do. I hope we talk soon. And
Thank you so much, Michael.
I love the conversation and the topic. And thank you so much for your time today. Sending the best regards.
Always a pleasure talking to you, my friend. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This video is brought to you by HalloCasa. Our tool transforms independent local real estate agents to global real estate agents. Create your own profile for free and get contacted by international investors. Sign up with the link in the description.